5 reasons to live in Latin America. I wanted to dedicate this video on an important topic that should help many of you move to a different country in Latin America. One of the issues we're about to address in this video is a burning issue. It's a big issue, and we're going to address this issue today. It's an issue that affects so many of you. And I think by the end of watching this video, you guys will have a better understanding of how you can solve one of the most burning issues of all. Let's get started with this video. So the first reason why living in Latin America may be worth it to you, may be worth it to another person, is because of the ease with which you can obtain residency and citizenship. If you've been following us on this very channel, you're probably aware of the fact that we've been back in countries that are liberal. We love liberal countries. Liberal countries are welcome on this channel. And I think nomadism is all about cycles. You know how life is all about cycles. And the cycle you're in changes every so often, right? Changes very often. Based on that, and based on the cycle that some of you might be in, which is the cycle where you really want to establish yourself in a new country. And when we're talking about establishment in a foreign country, we're obviously also talking about residency and citizenship. Residency and citizenship are two vital components that must be included in this relocation package, assuming you want to establish yourself in a foreign country. You've also heard us talk about Southeast Asia a lot and how many countries in Southeast Asia are not as liberal as European and Latin American countries. And this is an issue that I wanted to bring to your awareness, especially if you're in this cycle where you really want to step foot in a place for good. You want to potentially transfer funds over to your new country. And how can you do that if you're not allowed to get residency? And there are different types of residency programs available. And sometimes people argue, well, certain countries in Asia, they do offer permanent residency, but they really don't. And we've seen this during the pandemic when certain countries in Southeast Asia, including pretty much all countries, we're talking the Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia, these countries, they did not allow their permanent residents to return home. Now think about it. If you're in a situation like this, let's say you have a family there and you cannot return to your home base for the simple reason that the government doesn't want you there at the moment, which happened to be during the pandemic. An emergency situation took place, yet the government did not welcome you with open arms during this so desperate and urgent situation that you guys were in. We've talked to many people who this really happened to. On the contrary, Latin America has opened its arms to everyone during the pandemic. Of course, there were some exceptions, but the majority of Latin America was very open during the pandemic. And even visitors, tourists, they were welcome during the pandemic. And so permanent residency, unconditional permanent residency with a clear path to citizenship is what you want. Because at the end of the day, which leads us to the next point, which we're going to talk about here in a moment, but with permanent residency, you can convert to citizenship. If you take a look at a country like Argentina that allows you to become a citizen within 2 short years of living in the country, we can clearly see that we are talking about a country that is very liberal immigration policies. And of course, Argentina is just one of the countries. If we take a look at Paraguay, right? After 3 years of residency, you can convert your residency into citizenship, right? And again, we're seeing a similar pattern here where Latin countries, they want you to migrate to their countries. They want you there. And it has to do with the fact that Latin America has been open to immigrants for a very long time. We're talking before, during, and after World War II, but it actually goes back much further than this. If we take a look at the history, how Latin America was built pretty much by immigrants. So I'm not saying that colonization was a good thing. Colonization was certainly not a good thing, but because of this period of colonization, Latin America got accustomed to immigrants flowing into the continent or into the continents and treating them pretty well. And so based on that, we have now this great standard of how Latin countries treat immigrants. And I think that's very important if you want that. Oh, and of course, that leads us now to the next point, which is, of course, property ownership. However, it is my personal opinion that before you should own property in any country, you want to make sure that you are eligible to obtain permanent residency, unconditional permanent residency, with a path to citizenship. In my humble opinion, you don't want to buy a property in a country where you don't belong to, where you cannot become a citizen, because again, at the end of the day, what you want is to become a citizen. You want to be part of the country. And the question is, do you really want to invest in a country that does not offer you this so needed path to citizenship? So once you have permanent residency, path to citizenship, you can worry about the next part, which is property ownership. The reason why I'm saying this is, again, during the pandemic, people were locked out of Southeast Asia who had permanent residency, and even their own citizens were also locked out of the region. Now imagine that you have a property in Southeast Asia, you cannot take care of the property, and it actually goes much deeper than that. This is just the tip of the iceberg. So many problems were associated with not being able to return back home, which happened to be Southeast Asia. Another big problem, and I have seen one of my subscribers leave a tragic comment. It was a real tragedy. He left a comment saying that he was not allowed into Malaysia for a prolonged time during the pandemic. And the following thing happened. His bank, I don't remember what bank he stayed at, the bank in Malaysia did not allow him to transfer money out of Malaysia for a 1-year period, something like that. He had to hire a lawyer to get access to his funds. Now imagine doing that. Imagine all the legal problems. Imagine the headaches, the problems that incur when a country does not allow you to access your own assets or your own home base during a time of emergency. Really think about that. I don't think this is how it should be. You should be welcome anytime. And so anyway, based on that, property ownership, yes, you want to own property in a foreign country eventually. First, you want to make sure that you are actually welcome in that country. So make sure that this country offers you a liberal immigration policy, because with that liberal immigration policy, you can make many more things happen, such as incorporating a company, opening a bank account, you can own property, and so forth. Let's address the elephant in the room, racism. Racism is a big concern. People don't like to talk about it. It's usually a subject that is wiped under the table. People don't like to discuss racism, especially when they're together in a group. Even online, it's an untalked subject that I believe deserves a lot more attention, and by the way, requires a lot more attention to solve this burning issue that people have. Racism concerns everyone. I personally have experienced racism in certain countries I have visited, as much as people of color have experienced racism in countries who they visited. And that's a tragedy, because we're living in the 21st century, yet racism remains a burning problem, a burning issue. With that being said, racism exists everywhere. It exists in Europe, it exists in America, it exists in Latin America, it exists in Africa, and even in Asia and Australia. Racism is present everywhere. So I'm not saying that certain countries, they're exempt from racism. No, I'm not saying that. But certain countries, now we're talking again in Latin America, certain countries in Latin America are much less racist than certain countries in Asia. You can guess why that is. It has again to do with the fact of colonization. Colonization changed the landscape, it changed the mental perception of people in the region, since they were exposed to people from different cultures, different skin colors. They had to deal with it. So whenever you get exposed to something, guess what you can do, or what you have to do? You have to deal with it. Because back in the day, there was no option. You had to deal with it. You were confronted and you had to solve the issue right on the spot. Based on the experiences, based on colonization, which again, I've talked about this in a previous video, colonization was not a good thing for the indigenous people. The indigenous people were forced into slavery, change of religion, they were raped. Many horrible things happened because of colonization. Yet, Latin countries remain liberal to even people from Europe who colonized them for centuries. So we have to give a lot of praise, a lot of appreciation to these countries, because they are treating us better than other countries that this did not happen to. So what you want to do is, right, if you're a person of color, or even if you're European, if you're North American, It doesn't matter what color shirt you wear. It's really important that you go to a place where you feel welcome, where there is like this nice vibe in the air, a vibe of, being welcome, being appreciated, being wanted. And I faced racism in Indonesia. It is a country I will never, ever return to. I have my reasons, I have my experiences, and how I was treated by customs in Indonesia was completely unjustified, so not a single penny will be spent in that country ever again, at least not from this very pocket. Anyway, so racism is definitely the elephant in the room, and we addressed it now, so make sure that, especially if you are a person of color, that you really, really consider where you move to, because I don't want you to experience racism in wherever, Asia, Europe, so make sure you really research the country well, because again, moving abroad is a difficult decision. It's a time-consuming, also an expensive decision, so please make sure you consider that. Then another big reason to live in Latin America is, of course, language. And what I'm trying to say here is, of course, that for a North American, for a European, it's just so much easier to learn Spanish than it is to learn Thai, Vietnamese, Malay, Filipino. Even though Malay is probably a bit easier to learn than something like Thai or Vietnamese. But still, in Latin America, right, most countries speak Spanish, of course. Brazil is an exception. People in Brazil speak Portuguese, but South America, Spanish is pretty much spoken everywhere. Even people in Brazil speak Spanish, not all of them, but many people do. With that being said, it's just easier to learn Spanish than, like I said, to learn Thai, Vietnamese, Japanese, Korean, Mandarin. The letters are just more difficult languages to learn, so really think about that too. And that's a big reason why people do choose to live in Latin America versus Asia. It's just easier also to integrate. That's actually another big reason why you want to live in Latin America. It's easier to integrate in Latin America's culture and with the people than it is in Asia. I don't think it has so much to do with Asia's introvertism. Yes, Asia is very introverted and Latin America is very extroverted, yet it's just easier to integrate. And of course, it has a little bit to do with personality type, but again, it has to do with past exposure. And Latin America has that, whereas Asia also had it, but just not to the same extent, not the same depth. And I think that's very, very important. Then the last very, very important point, reason to live in Latin America is, of course, the time zone, which is so often neglected, overlooked, just not considered. And I think when it comes to growing a business, if you're an aspiring young entrepreneur, or if you're an established entrepreneur who wants to dive into a different culture, who wants to reduce his living costs, who potentially wants to get a different experience out of life at this specific point, but you're like, hey, I don't want to sacrifice my whole business in order to make that happen. Well, you can move to Latin America and enjoy the time zone benefits that are also lacking in Asia. And that's especially true for people who have companies in North America, because again, the time zone is a big deal, especially if you have to work with clients, with people, if you have to do calls, or if you have to do any kind of support, or just like network over the internet, you have to go into meetings, and let's say the people you're working with, they happen to be in North America, the companies are located there, so your contractors, right, your suppliers, your team, your employees, your partners, they're based in North America, and it's just so much harder for you to make that happen when you are in a time zone like Asia that is not very conducive to productivity for somebody who wants to build a business in North America, yet be in a different country, or even a different time zone, but it's still a time zone that's much closer. And so that's something that I highly recommend that you consider as well. Subscribe now and turn on alerts to never miss any of my future nomadism, dating, and business advice videos. Thank you for watching.